All right. So like I mentioned, we launched the, what's it called? Module 4 project. So this is going to be on time series. So this is most relevant, or the sections most relevant to this project are really like sections 31 and 32, where we talk about time series. So we'll actually, this is not really about the project, but like we'll actually talk about that later today in our study group. But I just wanted to share some parts about the project and show you guys what you can do. So let me pull this up real quick. See, it's weird. Okay. I was looking for my notebook and now I remember where I put it. I kept it so I wouldn't forget. And of course, I forgot. All right. So let me go and start sharing my screen. And all these screens look exactly the same. Sorry, everyone. I'm going to choose you. No, that's not it. Where? Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to just show you guys where to find too many windows. Oh my gosh. I'm clicking on the wrong things. I know you guys can't see that part. Okay, I'll show you guys. It actually launched over, or deployed, I should say, in the curriculum. So you can see here, module 4, end of module 4 project. Okay, and so this one again is we are giving you a data set. In this case, it's specifically a CSV file. I believe it comes from Zillow's challenge. Yeah. So just know again, like as always, the README has all the information of like about what this project is, what the expectations are. Also on the Learn dashboard, we'll have the rubric and just know it's kind of like the typical one, making sure you fulfill the correct requirements. Always, like I say, or like I said before, is to pass the project assessment, you have to make sure you have all the parts of the project, as well as at least having, oh shoot, I forget the name of it. Like there's developing, and basically it's like you have to at least be beyond developing. So if I can show you guys, let's see if I can bring this up real quick. Let's see. We are March cohort. All right, so I haven't launched it yet, but there'll be a project rubric. So just like last time, this is for the last project we just did. But you have to at least have accomplished on this part. If you have a check mark under developing, basically I don't pass you on the project assessment. So just kind of, this is kind of like your go-to. Of course, it's a little bit different from what you see here, but it's pretty similar. I'll launch that out today, update the Learn dashboard so you can see this better. But just kind of know what's going through. You can see that the curriculum, final project. And so in this repo right here, to start it off, you can, I'm trying to get this to load. There we go. So there's the README that kind of explains, oh, this is the wrong one. Wait, oh, sorry guys. I'm still in the wrong place in my head. There we go, module 4. Okay, so if you look at this repo, okay, is you'll notice that, there's the README like always, there's a Zillow data CSV file, and there's also a starter notebook. So in this starter notebook, this is actually really useful to just get yourself organized. So just kind of know is that like this is actually already within this notebook by itself. So you don't necessarily have to use a starter notebook. You can use a different format as long as you're achieving the stuff that you need to. But just know that it's there to help you get started. So with that, I kind of show you guys a few notes about this particular project. System, yes, okay. So just kind of go through some basic requirements of like any project that we do is that you have to turn it in, there we go. Okay, you have to make sure you turn all the parts of your project assessment in through Learn before we do our actual project assessment, like one-on-one. So just make sure you do that ahead of time. It also helps on our back end basically, so we can make sure it's like, okay, like if we do an assessment and you don't turn it in on there, I can't basically mark you off as pass or fail or whatnot, or give you guys feedback. So just be super aware of this. Remember, you have to have the notebook, your actual presentation, which is your non-technical piece. And of course, there's the video part, which I know this is kind of, it's not actually talked about in that repo right now, but it is an element that has to be turned in. And that video, you don't have to stress out too much about it. It's just recording of your non-technical piece. And then of course your blog post. So I'll go through each one of these in a second. But before I do that, I kind of want to talk about this project in general. So again, we're going to do a time series analysis. So this is going to be, like I said, sections 31 and 32 are the most relevant to this part. And your biggest thing is basically saying, what are the top 5 best zip codes? And as the repo kind of, or the README kind of says, what is the best zip code? That's subjective. So this is going to have to determine, like, what do you mean by best? And you have to decide for the business case owner, what does that mean by best? And in this case, we're talking to a financial real estate investment firm. So if you can approach it this way, if you want to approach your audience as a different kind of thing, let me know ahead of time. That way, if you say, oh, we're approaching this in the sense of maybe, like the average person versus an actual investment firm, it might be a very different kind of story. But in this case, we're kind of starting it off and say, okay, well, we're talking to an investment firm that's looking to invest in the quote unquote best zip codes. Okay, so that means they're going to buy it and then sell it later on, or maybe do something else. So this might have to be a little bit of extra research on like exactly, background domain knowledge of like how do you invest in a house? What are things that are taken into account? So one thing that like the repo kind of, or the README says is, talk about risk, your profit margins. If you're not super familiar with these parts, this is where domain knowledge really comes through. Always asking questions to each other and also to me, it's always super helpful. So just kind of know that that's there. And then I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but just know that there's also the video that needs to be submitted on here as well. So this is the record walkthrough on when you turn in right here. All right. So just know this is the basics of the project itself. So talking about this though, I want to give you guys some general advice. So for the notebook, this is kind of typical stuff, is you want to keep your notebook clean and organized. Your code should be readable, should be easy to follow. Again, the starter notebook is really useful. They help you get you organized, make sure everything works really well. Like I emphasize over and over again, a notebook preferably should have some kind of narrative. And the way I say that is like a reader can start from the top of the notebook and read it all the way down and understand and follow your thought process. So you should assume when someone first grabs the notebook and looks at it, that they have never seen this particular data set before. They might be familiar with data science itself, but the data set is completely new to them. So this might be something that you have to consider. If in the real world you're making a notebook or some kind of like a report to someone and there is some background knowledge that they already know, of course, that's a different kind of story. But in here, I think it's a good idea to kind of assume the person doesn't know what the data set looks like, right? And this shows you basically when you explore it, any EDA, and then any process you actually go into, okay? So let's see here. Your final product might not be exactly how you approach it. So, this is a good point. So sometimes, and this happens a lot of times, you'll run code, and you might run the cell over and over and over again. And that's perfectly fine, just to test things out. But when you actually make your notebook together, it should, in a sense, just be able to run once all the way from the top to the bottom and run consistently with no errors, no weird stuff that comes through. So one thing I do is if I'm kind of like playing around, like I might run cells back and forth, jump up and down, I'll organize it, test things out, and then I'll organize it some. And then like about every 30 minutes, I'll make sure to like take a little break, say, okay, make sure it all works, by basically restarting the kernel, run the whole thing from top to bottom and make sure there's no errors. That way I don't get to the very bottom, like, cool, I'm all done with my project. It looks great. And I try to run it. I restart from the beginning. It's like, oh, it's not working. I'm like, well, what went wrong? I don't remember. So this is a good kind of check of like, as you go through to make sure it runs all the way through. And so just know that, again, it's a narrative. It doesn't mean necessarily the way you actually approached it the first time. It's the way you want to present it forward. Okay. Let's see here. And the last part is that remember, it's much more of a conversation with a data-minded person. So in our notebook, our technical one-on-one part, it's about 30-ish minutes. And this is going to be much more of a back and forth. So just kind of know that you're talking to someone who is a little more technical, someone who knows data science. It could be, you can think of them as your, maybe someone on your data team or your data science manager, something along those lines. So they're a little more technical in that case compared to your non-technical presentation. All right. Any questions you guys have on this? This hopefully feels pretty review since we have had done a project before. Okay, cool. All right, and so next part then we have is our presentation. So some notes on that. Keep it about 5 minutes. 8 minutes is probably at the higher end. 10 minutes maximum. If you're going over 10 minutes, you're going way too long. Also, speaking of that, if you're going underneath 3 minutes, that's way too short. It really should be about 5 minutes, maybe 5 to 8, and that's reflected in the rubric as well. One thing I emphasize is you are the subject of the presentation, not the slides. Make sure that like the person you're presenting to actually understands, is that you're not trying to get someone just to read your slides. If you find people just essentially reading your slides and not paying attention to you, then why do they need you? You can just basically just give them a pamphlet and that'd be fine. The important part is that you are giving this information, and so you want to make sure that your slides are emphasizing your points, not that people are looking at your slides and you're emphasizing your slide points. Hopefully that makes sense. And then less is more. So this is true for not just like words, but also like too much info with a visualization. If your visualization is very complicated, maybe for a presentation, especially for a non-technical, you need to slim it down, maybe use a different visualization, or maybe break your visualization into different parts. One thing I actually would suggest that I didn't put here directly is if you're doing multiple visualizations on the same topic, sometimes it might make sense to actually split up those visualizations into different slides. You don't have to present both visualizations next to each other just because they're related. The reason you might want to do that is so that way you can completely focus on that aspect of the visualization. Okay. Any questions so far? I see most people's videos are off. Hopefully I haven't been frozen. I'm just talking to myself right now, right? Any sign of life?
No, you're good.
Okay, good. I was a little worried for a second. I wasn't sure. Okay, cool. So yeah, so no questions. Awesome. So here's some tips that I have. These are not requirements. These are advice that I give. Note that this is also my personal style. So just because I say this is like what I prefer doesn't mean it's the truth that you should do, or you won't pass an assessment because you don't these specific parts. But you'll probably hear me give advice exactly this way. Okay. So one thing you should consider is each slide should contain a thought or concept. So what I like to say is like, sometimes people think like, oh, I should only have 6 slides because it's a very short presentation. I personally prefer people to put in more slides. Let's see, there's a question here. No. Fictional, I don't know if that's, if there's a question, let me know. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Having more slides can be really useful just to basically break things up. So I'm actually, like, I personally would be perfectly fine presenting on like maybe 10 to 20 seconds on a slide. And as long as that slide is like, I'm 10 seconds of like a bunch of words. If it's essentially just one visualization or if just like a couple bullet points, I can spend like a very short amount of time on there because there are just 2 main words on there. So this kind of also forces you to kind of make your slides very pointed. So that way you kind of keep all this information in there. I like to say, ideally, the slide introduces or summarizes a topic. So it shouldn't be like, if I'm talking about, especially to a non-technical audience, I might have an exact metric that, you know, like, and say all these different parts or like how we did this. I won't put all that information on the slide because that's not relevant to them. What they care about is what the actual results are or what's the overall summary. Or if I'm introducing, saying, well, you know, we approach this part, you know, what are we doing? Like, I might have an introduction, like, concept on that slide. Okay. One personal thing I have is, again, trying to keep things slimmed down, no more than 3 bullets per slide. Again, this is a personal preference. Not everyone agrees with this, but I think is that if you keep it to 3 points, those should just be very quick things to read. If you need more bullet points, and even 3 might even do this, is maybe you should split into multiple slides. So then if you're reading like a whole list of things, it's either that list is super important. In that case, maybe that's something you have to hand out in a sense, like if you're in the real world. But if it's not like that, usually what happens to bullet points, and really those should be their own separate slide talking about each individual part. The problem is if you get too many bullet points, people will stop listening to you and will start looking at your slides and try to read it through. Okay. So one kind of follow up this to keep things nice and short is only use sentence fragments. This is, again, a personal style. Is if you like this right here, I actually feel like this is too many words. Like even if this was one little slide, I would feel like this is too much, because when you give sentences, people read it through. But a lot of times you can just summarize the whole concept of that sentence with like 2 or 3 words. So this helps kind of slim down how much words you actually are putting in there. The only exception that I can really think about that I think is super important would be a formal definition. If there's some quote or formal definition, then of course I would use a full sentence to make sure it's very precise. But a lot of times the slide's summarizing me anyway, so I don't need it to be really precise and like exactly the right terminology. Okay. And then last thing, visual and pictures. So a visual shouldn't be complicated. We talked about this before. I kind of like compare this to like having sentences. It's like a really complicated visual takes time for you to comprehend. Just like a sentence, you have to read the whole sentence versus 2 or 3 words. If you want to emphasize your point, using a simple visualization can be helpful. But if you make it too complicated, people will start focusing on the visualization and completely ignore you. Don't just stick a visual on and just like leave it there and just talk out loud and never reference the visual. If you have a visualization, do a quick walkthrough. Say, oh, we can see here, you know, for example, the number of sales has increased over this time period. Like point those parts out, point to what's important and what the audience should be looking at in your visualization. And just re-emphasizing, pictures can give a high density of information, which can be a really good thing, but also can be really like, in a sense, distracting thing. If you have a visualization or, you know, the extreme of this might be GIFs. Animations in my mind on presentations can be really distracting because they're continuously moving and like basically your eyes are drawn towards it and you're no longer paying attention. Same thing with very like, you know, complicated visualizations. So note that kind of like balance that you don't want people to distract out there, but also know that sometimes a visualization or a quick picture can emphasize the same thing as like a bunch of sentences can. Okay. Any questions on any of these kind of little tips? All right. Sound good? Cool. All right. And then just a quick thing about the video, just make sure you record this. It also helps to give you more practice. I know not everyone likes, you know, recording. Don't feel like you have to keep recording this. Like if you find yourself recording this like 5 times over, that's too many. It should like maybe you do a little practice before, you know, kind of get a warm up, feel about how much time it is, and then record the presentation. You don't have to record yourself on the presentation if you don't want to, right? You can if you want, but the main thing is the slides and basically presenting that part. And it helps give you practice, and it's something for you to reference too. So if you want to look back on it, you can actually see what you did and say, oh, this is what I could improve myself on. Okay. And then the last thing is the blog. So in the repo or in the README, they have specific parts that are saying here, I am much more fluid on exactly what your requirements are for this blog. So my suggestion is actually focus on one aspect of the project that you find interesting. And the reason why I say be interesting is so that way you can talk about it. If you find it interesting, it's a lot easier to write about. It's a lot easier to go into detail and stuff like that. You might find out that you're writing too much. So this is a good thing. You want to be able to have to more easily write about it. What I usually find is people just write a summary of their project and what they did. And it's, to be quite frank, it's boring. Like, I don't want to read it. It's like, oh, like they're just kind of talking about how their process is. And it's no offense to the person reading. It's just that you can tell it doesn't feel as exciting. So that's something that you can kind of do. And this is definitely a writing practice. Like that's not something necessarily that we are showing a lot, but it's super important to be able to communicate. And you can think of this as something like your hiring manager in the future might be looking for. When they search for you, maybe this is something that and that's not to put you guys like, oh no, I need to like, I'm super freaked out that someone's going to find this thing I wrote. It's much more so just be aware that you want it to be engaging, not just something you just check your, like do a little checkbox on. And note that it should be technical. There can't, but repo kind of says, you know, balance between technical and non-technical. I would say if you are going to one direction, go more technical than non-technical. And that's because like usually if you're really going technical, it's because you care about that part. Also, you want to show that you know what you're doing. You're not just talking about like, you know, data science in the abstract. You want to say, oh, let me show you a specific thing that you can do. And so there should be code snippets or visualizations, basically parts that show the reader how to do this thing or what you did. Okay. Any questions so far on that video or blog aspect? Cool. All right. I'm not hearing any questions, so I think we're good. All right. So this comes down to the actual project. So in this project, it's a time series, like I said, data set. So there's a few tips I'm going to say. So one is make sure you focus on the business case. What does the business want? And that business, again, the README actually suggests using like an investment firm. You don't necessarily have to use that. If there is something different, let me know. But I think a good, easy one is just say, oh, it's an investment firm, because you can have an idea of what an investment firm would want. And note that question then, what are the 5 best zip codes? that's an important aspect of saying like, what is best? Best can be defined by a lot of different things, and you kind of have to decide, and there's not a right answer. There's not like, oh, the best is this. You have to define what makes sense for best for your business stakeholders. Okay. Let's see here. One thing I would suggest, and this is debatable, if you want to go for all the zip codes, go for it. I say you don't necessarily have to go for every zip code. If you have a very specific like case, like, okay, let me look at just like this state or maybe these metropolitan areas, you can do that. That, in my opinion, that might be helpful in the sense of like getting an idea of how to do this. Maybe you practice it with like just one state and then say, okay, I understand how this works now. Can I expand this out to other states? And now you can kind of do that thing. So just kind of be aware, is like, you know, this zip code might be different, you know, depending on what questions you're asking to find out what the best is. All right. Any questions on this business case? Cool. All right.
I have a comment about that.
Yeah.
So yes, it says it's a fictional investment firm. Keep in mind, HUD is an investment firm. So profit is made on urban development. So what HUD is looking for is going to be very different from like a timeshare company. Somebody a little bit more predatory or less predatory is going to look for varying amounts of picker-upper status in the house.
That's a good point.
Yeah, there are companies who specifically look for up-and-coming suburban areas, and that's all they do, you know?
No, thank you. That's actually a really good point, because even though I say like, you know, that investment firm, just because we say investment firm doesn't necessarily mean it's that specific, you know, like all investment firms are exactly the same. It might be something different. So I think a good one might be for you guys, if you're like really want to dig into this project and you're really enjoying this, maybe pick, you know, a real life, you know, like business stakeholder and pretend you're pitching to them, because that could be really essentially like help guide you in like what your principles are. And if you have trouble with this, you know, definitely reach out and, you know, we can share a little bit like, you know, who we want to focus on and things like that. I think it'd be really interesting to see what everyone kind of gears themselves towards. Cool. Yeah. So last part is about the actual data itself for the time series. Note that there are missing data. Okay. So you'll have to figure out what data is missing, null values and stuff like this. There might be reasons why it's missing. You have to decide, obviously, with all missing data, what do you do with it? And if you do drop it, you know, is that going to affect you? Is it going to affect a lot? Is there a reason why you're dropping? Maybe, for example, if a certain time of only certain data is relevant to this time period, so maybe data wasn't collected before, maybe there are particular reasons. Like you have to kind of make sure you give a good explanation of what you're going to do with this missing data. Note that the data is not formatted necessarily for a good time series. I'm going to straight up tell you guys, it's not formatted in the way we've seen time series and other data before. So you will have to kind of manage this a little bit. To be quite honest, it's not too bad if you kind of approach this right. But I think it's something that's relatively new and not something that we specifically talk about. So maybe this is something we can talk about in office hours and kind of guide through and say, you know, what can we do about data? You'll have to remove certain columns, you know, things that aren't needed, obviously, right? But one suggestion I would say is check out this package melt, or not package, sorry, this method melt that's built into Pandas. And this can be helpful to help you get the data into the right format you want. Some similar things might be like transpose and stuff like this. And we can talk a little bit more as you guys dive deep into it. But this is an important aspect to just keep in mind, right? Also note that the region names are zip codes. So in the data file, it says region names. Region names are really just zip codes, but just be careful with that. Also, it might make sense to look at the city and metro area. So when you explore this part, you'll see that there is a metro area, there are a state listed in there, and the zip code as well. So you, depending on what your business case is and what specifically you want to focus on, you might want to filter in specifically about this area. Okay, and don't forget about the EDA. Don't forget about exploring the data. It's always important to know what your data kind of looks like before you start doing any modeling or any kind of analysis in there. Okay, cool. Any overall questions about this? All right, sound good? Cool. So hopefully that gives you guys a good start and like, you know, what the project's supposed to look like and, you know, ways to attack it. Obviously the best thing to do is actually look at the data and check it out. This starter notebook, I'll just kind of quickly show you. Let's see here if I have this. Yes. So this is actually within the repo itself. I would strongly suggest going off of this. You can see here basically there's goes through different steps. You don't necessarily have to use these exact steps. You don't have to even use this notebook at all, but I'd highly suggest it because it's really useful. So just know that, for example, it's in a wide format. So like we have basically like these times going over here. You might want to reorganize this to form it closer into this format right here, where we have our time individually like this. So know that it's going to do some data restructuring. Okay. And then they talk about, obviously helper functions. If you're using the same stuff over and over again, defining a function and then reusing it is really helpful. Not just for, just easy to read, but also just to manage it. If you make one little change, like, oh wait, I need to add this aspect in like how I process the data, it makes sense to like change just that function versus changing everything. Okay. All right. And then of course we have these different steps that are kind of filled out for you: loading the data, processing the data, doing an EDA, a visualization. Oh, that's nice. So in the startup, I actually didn't realize this. They kind of show you a little bit of how to change it from wide to long format. So this is probably like a tricky part that we hadn't really seen before. So as you get closer to this part too, definitely reach out and we can kind of walk through it together. And then our modeling, we'll talk about a little bit of this today. It's also in the curriculum for section 32. Okay. And then of course, interpreting results. Probably the most, like in a sense, the most important aspect. Like you can do all of this stuff, but it doesn't mean anything if you can't say why it matters. All right, cool. And I'll let you guys get to that. Any last questions about the project in general? Awesome, cool. So I'll go ahead and stop my recording.